Welcome, everybody. Firstly, thank you to the Jewish Heritage Alliance. Thank you for the invitation to address you all. It's a great honor and pleasure to be able to communicate and share what is obviously something important to all of us here tonight, the heritage and the story of the great Jewish leaders, the rabbis from Portugal. And we're going to talk about the amazing legacy and story of one individual in particular, Rabbi Abraham Saba. And this story is particularly linked and connected to the holiday of Hanukkah as well. So we'll also, God willing, connect this story to the holiday that we're all thinking about and celebrating now as well. The story takes us from 1492, coming from Spain to Portugal. Then, of course, from Portugal, the expulsion from Portugal takes us to Morocco, and finally culminates with the printing of Rabbi Saba's book, which we're marking this year 500 years since it was printed. So we'll touch on all of that tonight and hopefully learn something important along the way. So let's start with 1492. In 1492, the bulk of Castilian Jewry, according to Rabbi Abraham Zacuto, he tells us that Ikar, the bulk of Castilian Jewry, Nichnas le Portugal, arrives to Portugal. One of them is Rabbi Saba. Rabbi Saba has lived in Spain, in Castilla, his whole life, and he's a rabbi, particularly the type of rabbi who lectures, who talks, he travels and speaks. He's in Hebrew, a darshan, a preacher. With the expulsion of 1492, he chooses the closest, most familiar, and most common route of Jews who chose to leave Spain with the expulsion of 1492 and comes to Portugal. Similar language, very similar culture, much easier to adapt than some of the other destinations where Jews chose to go then. Rabbi Saba comes to Portugal and he dedicates his life to one goal. He has one mission. He decides to write and complete his commentary to the Torah. He's been working on this before, but now he has time. He doesn't settle in Lisbon when he comes to Portugal. He's not in a big city. He's not even in Porto. He's in Guimarães, which has a much smaller Jewish presence. But there he's dedicated not really to communal activity as far as we know, but to completing his stated goal of writing a commentary to the whole Torah. And he does that. He finishes a commentary to the entire 5 books of Moses, to the whole Torah, as well as some commentaries to other books. And this has been the focus of his life. Fast forward. It's now December 5th, 1496. Dom Manuel, the King of Portugal, has just signed the Edict of Expulsion. The Jews now are seemingly being forced to leave Portugal once, just like they've left Spain. However, in contrast to the expulsion from Spain, the Jews are given a long time. It's not going to take effect for 10 months. And it becomes apparent that Dom Manuel, the king, has a different agenda than what took place 5 years earlier in Spain. He wants to expel the Jews, but he doesn't really want them to leave. And what ends up happening, he comes up with this plan of expelling the Jews, not letting them leave, and forcing them all to convert, which Rabbi Saba and others just describe. Instead of describing this episode as an expulsion, they described it as the great Shmad, the great conversion, forced conversions. But as this unfolds, it unfolds in steps. So again, Rabbi Saba is living in Guimarães. With the Edict of Expulsion now coming into force, he's forced to pick up and go again and leave. But this is the mentality that thousands of Jews in Portugal had. The majority of the Jews living in Portugal at this point have already been expelled once before. So, from their perspective, you've expelled us once. Okay, expel us twice. We're ready to go. We're going to stay faithful to our tradition, to our religion. Initially, the king announces that there's going to be safe passage. There'll be ships waiting to take Jewish people from 3 ports of their choice. Rabbi Emmanuel Aboab, who's born in the 16th century in Porto, he tells us how he heard about all this from his father. He says that the king initially announced that there would be boats waiting to take Jews from the cities of Porto, from Setúbal and Lisbon. Later on, the announcement is changed. No, not Setúbal, not Porto, just Lisbon. And Lisbon is where the Jewish people are forced to make themselves as the expulsion order is unfolding. But before they go to Lisbon, they are instructed to deposit their books. And Rabbi Saba describes to us how he brings his library and he deposits his library in the city of Porto. Porto is relatively close to Guimarães, and that's where Rabbi Saba is forced to give away his library. He is no longer able to maintain his collection of Jewish books that he had with him. His great collection, his library, is what he used to compose his commentary in the first place. His commentary to the Torah was full of quotes from Kabbalah and Medrash and all types of different classical Jewish sources. It must have been a fantastic, amazing work. While he gave and deposited all his books in Porto, there's one book he could not let go of. And that was his actual manuscript, what he had been working on for the last 5 years of his life. That, he tells us, he could not bring himself to give up. He keeps that with him. And he tells us how he's placed himself in danger. He writes, I placed myself in danger by maintaining this manuscript with me. He brings it with him. Where to? To Lisbon, where all the Jews were expecting boats. But when he gets there, there are no boats. Not only that, a rumor begins to circulate that any Jew who's caught with any religious artifact, anything in Hebrew, would be put to death. So Rabbi Saba describes to us with a heavy heart how he, together with 2 Jews, went outside the city and buried his manuscripts under an olive tree, hoping, of course, to be able to recover it later. And he describes the heart-rending scene, how he describes this beautiful olive tree. And he says it was so beautiful. He says, in effect, it was a tree full of Torah. All of his commentary was there. Yet, he says, to me, it was a tree of tears, because there I buried the apple of my eye. Because this, listen to what he says, is what I comforted myself after my children were forcibly taken from me, forced to be converted. Rabbi Saba is then put in jail. During the forced conversion, he describes how, together with only another handful of individuals who, under no circumstances, even after days and days of being without food or drink, were unwilling to even in any form accept this forced conversion, he was therefore placed in jail, hoping to break his spirit. And after 6 months or so, the king realized that that wouldn't happen. Rabbi Saba and a handful of others were sent off to Arzila, the North African coast, banished from Portugal, and that's where he arrives without anything. And he describes how from Arzila he went to Alcácer Quibir, and how the community there clothed him, took care of him. And he describes how sick he was. Not sick necessarily physically, but he describes how sick he was, how much he missed his children, his books. And in particular, he says, my manuscript, what I composed. But there, in Alcácer Quibir, without any books, all he had was one book, the book of the Torah. He decides to write his commentary to the Torah again. And he begins writing at a furious pace. And by spring of 1499, he already is completing his rewritten commentary to the book of Exodus. But then he falls sick, becomes physically ill. He almost dies. What was he thinking about at those moments? He tells us. He tells us in his commentary that it was while he was on his sick bed in Fez, where he moved to from Al-Qasr Kabir. He tells us, and I'll read to you. When I was sick, lying in bed, I thought to myself, why is the holiday of Hanukkah called Hanukkah? Where does the name come from? He says other holidays, for example, Pesach, God passes over, Passover. Or the holiday of Purim is related to the lottery that Haman made. Sukkot, when we celebrate with the sukkah, is the huts that God built to protect us. But where does the name Hanukkah come from? And he says, while I was on my sick bed in Morocco, it came to me that the name Hanukkah is related to the number Chanu. The Jews rested, were secure and tranquil. Chanu, Chafhei. Chanu, Ka. Chafhei is 25. He says 25 is the number related to the number of words in the verse of Shema. He says the Jews persevered, overcame the odds in the holiday of Hanukkah because of Shema. What is Shema? The headline Jewish prayer, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, the testament of faith that is with the Jewish people through all challenges. He says that is what kept the Jewish people strong. And he says that's the etymology of the name Chanukah, Hanukkah, in his opinion. And he says as soon as he left his sick bed and stood up, he says he began to preach again, like in the good old days. He began to give sermons and talked about this in all synagogues, wherever he could, all over Fez. And with his renewed energy and with his renewed faith, he completed his manuscript a second time. He still complains periodically in his commentary. He says, this version is shorter than the first because I'm, don't have as many books here as I had in Portugal, where my library was taken from me. But he finishes his commentary to the Torah, and by the year 1501, he has now completed his rewritten Sror Hamor, and that book was published. Not in his lifetime, but apparently it seems like Rabbi Saba passed away in the end of the first decade of the 16th century. But by 1523, in the month of Kislev, the month of Hanukkah, this book began to be printed in the city of Venice by the famous Venetian printer Daniel Bomberg, originally from Antwerp, but he printed in Venice. And it began to be printed exactly 500 years ago, the end of Kislev, which is the Hebrew month where Hanukkah begins. And on the title page of this book, we have it here. This is the original first edition of this book that we have printed. It says in Kislev, Resh Pei Gimel, that's 1522, the Jewish year, 5,283, exactly 500 years ago. And finally, in the month of Shvat, which is coming up, on the 20th of Shvat in the year 1523, this book was completed, printed for the first time. So we're now marking 500 years since this book of Rabbi Saba was printed. And this story that he tells us in his commentary should inspire us to stay strong in face of all adversity, And one beautiful thing we see is his commentary to Hanukkah, we are sure, didn't appear in his first edition. It only came to him through adversity. It came to him while lying in bed sick. So sometimes through challenges, through difficult times, we gain insights and ideas that we've never had before. So let's take inspiration from Rabbi Saba, from his story. And of course, the holiday of Hanukkah, let's keep the Jewish flame burning and never forget our history, where we're coming from, and most importantly, where we're going. Happy Hanukkah. Thank you.